Knowing how money quietly started World War I, would you want to see the powerful and hidden role behind this war? How is it that the world's most powerful rulers, financiers, and bankers could not see the birth of this war? In the summer of 1914, the world order appeared stable from the outside. Europe's strong financial markets had a global vitality similar to the 2000s. Capital was flowing from west to east. Raw materials needed for factories were moving in the opposite direction. Immigrants were going to America for their dreams, and goods were flowing to Europe. This system was tied together by the confidence the gold standard provided across the entire world. States promised that their money was backed by gold, and history always shows this pattern, and markets carried out transactions in peace and confidence. But right beneath this visible order, there was something unnoticed and extremely fragile, ready to explode like a balloon: war. Because even before the war broke out, signs were everywhere that it would reveal itself sooner or later, but no one wanted to see or believe it. The system had already begun to crack long before anyone realized. And the strangest part was this: those who should have sensed the coming war the best, bankers, investors, financial giants like the Rothschilds, the modern financial titans of Europe, were unaware of everything. Or it suited them to be unaware. For financiers, war was seen only as a political tension between states comparing their power. They did not see it as a threat that would directly determine and reshape the value of their assets. Because if war began, government bonds would lose value or collapse, gold outflows would stop, and credit would freeze. Yet despite this, even in the days when Austria gave its ultimatum to Serbia, the London market was unusually, unbelievably calm. Lord Rothschild even wrote letters to his relatives in Paris between July 23rd to 28th saying, "This will not end in war. Russia will not intervene. England will preserve peace." Here, a curiosity rises inside a person. These were the people who would be most affected and harmed by war. How could the world's most powerful financiers not see the early signals of a coming war? The answer appeared very quickly the moment the war broke out. During the last week of July of that same year, bond prices fell between 4% and 13%. This decline was the alarm bell for the crises that would follow. But investors still believed the war would remain limited, would not spread, and would be resolved. However, they were terribly mistaken. On August 1st, the day Germany declared war on Russia, the London market experienced a sharp 5% collapse. Yet even then, no one realized that a major catastrophe was approaching. Even when the London Stock Exchange closed its operations on July 31st, no one foresaw that within a few days the financial systems affecting all of Europe would freeze. Because until then, the world had never been this interconnected financially. No one had foreseen that the collapse of one would trigger the collapse of another. But with this crash, they all saw the connection, and history placed the truth right in front of them. But the reality was much harsher than it appeared. The moment the war began, the international credit system collapsed, because trust had disappeared. No one knew what moves countries would make. In this environment, trade stopped instantly. Banks could not receive payments because there was no cash flow. Bills accepted in England became unpayable in a single moment. The giant financial authorities that governed the world at the center of Europe faced the biggest economic blow in history. The headlines of The Economist wrote, "A collapse of the international credit system never seen before." So why was this collapse so shocking and severe? Because at that time, investors' methods of measuring risk cannot be compared with ours today. Theirs were the complete opposite of what we use now. Today we talk about inflation, interest rates, budget deficits. But in 1914, there were no reliable data for any of these. Systems were only just forming and globalizing. Bondholders extracted information about a country's money and future solely from political developments in the governments that ruled them. But an unpredictable war meant falling income, rising debt, gold outflows, and collapsing bond prices. And because they were unprepared for this, they were hit in a brutally hard and sudden way. However, the financial market did not notice the coming war until the final week, or they did notice it, but did not take precautions. The reason was that everyone of that period was tightly bound to the belief that a great war would either never happen, or if it did, it would be short. What economists like Ivan Bloch and Norman Angell had said years earlier, "A great war is economically impossible," had already begun, and with all its severity it had started to sweep across the world. This idea had comforted the hearts of the financial world until the war actually began. As long as no conflict broke out for years, the reality of the danger drifted further away. Just like people living in earthquake zones forgetting the danger when no earthquake happens for a long time. So what did the financiers who failed to see the coming war face after the war began? The answer was short and devastating. The gold standard collapsed because the environment of trust disappeared. The credit system froze. Bonds lost half their value. Some states and governments could not pay their debts. Hyperinflation swept across Europe, and some of the world's greatest financial families lost half their wealth. But the greatest loss belonged to the millions that made up the people. Whatever little they had, they lost almost all of it. The early structure of globalization before the war had disappeared instantly. Attacking U-boats sank millions of tons of merchant ships. Countries withdrew into themselves, and freedom of movement came to a halt. When that enormous economic network collapsed in an instant, financiers saw for the first time how dependent, connected, and fragile the world truly was. But here, a new question emerged. If no one saw the arrival of the war, then who would guide the financial consequences of this war? The answer pointed to a single country that, within a few years, would determine the fate of the entire world: the United States of America. To understand this, we will explain the events within history, chronologically, and try to understand how this happened. The panic in the markets during the early days of the war was actually only the visible part of the iceberg. The invisible part was much more powerful and destructive. This was the problem states had with gold. Because once states and empires were forced to suspend the gold standard, the true financial cost of the war became clear. Gold tied the hands of countries, but the fuel of war was unlimited money and unlimited debt. Because they knew they could not cover the costs of war without gold in hand, they were forced to choose a dangerous alternative. So what was this dangerous decision? This is why the great powers, one by one, made the same decision. They would break their ties with gold, print money with purchasing power, expand debt, and borrow even more with the money printed. Thus, gold, which had been accepted as true value for centuries, would suddenly be freed from being a burden for states. So who did this break affect, and how? One of the countries that felt the harshest blow was France. Even before the war, its debt load was enormous. More than 70% of its national income went entirely to its debts. At the beginning of the war, almost half of France's heavy industry was occupied instantly during Germany's first attack. This meant the cutting of the country's most important economic artery. The money of the French people was in long-term investments and could not be converted into cash quickly. In short, there was no cash flow. Thus, France had to finance 85% of the cost of this great war with debt. This, over time, made it financially dependent on the United States and England. But here another curiosity arises. Those who know this naturally ask. France had one of the largest gold reserves in the world, and in an environment where gold had the highest purchasing power, because trust was collapsing, why did it still struggle so much and come to the edge of collapse? The answer was actually very simple. The cost of war was greater than all the gold they possessed. And the second reason, wanting to preserve its gold reserves, France tried not to spend this gold during the war and preferred not to spend it at all if possible, because it knew gold would still remain strong in the New World Order after the war. But this strategy, because the war was harsher and longer than expected, put the French economy face to face with extinction due to this wrong approach. A similar collapse was happening in Russia, but even more severe. Although Russia was a giant empire in terms of land size and manpower, it was, in contradiction to its size, one of the most fragile and weakest countries in Europe financially. Its banks were weak, its administration was scattered, and its production was only sufficient for itself. Despite this, Russia was a power large enough to determine the fate of the war, and for this reason France had been financing the Russian army for years. But as the war dragged on, Russia's debts exploded. To England, to France. It had billions of debt payments to the United States and Italy. This amount became far more than the Russian economy could bear. And the result was far, far beyond what was predicted. Inflation rose very rapidly, production stopped, and the Russian people were left in the middle of economic destruction. To say that the revolution that occurred here in 1917 was only a political explosion would be completely wrong, because it was the inevitable result of economic bankruptcy. However, the country that was right in the middle of the financial story of the war and in the most complicated position was, of course, England. Because England was the heart of the world's financial center. The pound was the global currency. The City of London was the center of the international credit network. For this reason, England did not want to spend the gold it held. On the contrary, like France, it wanted to protect its gold and remain hegemonic in the post-war world. But the war was like a sneaky enemy that disrupted everyone's strategy. England alone could not finance both its own army and the armies of its other allied partners. For this reason, from its own allies, especially France and Russia, it demanded gold shipments, almost as if asking for a bribe in the form of gold. In other words, it wanted gold to be sent for credit. So what did this lead to? Put yourself in the place of these allies for a moment. What would you think in the face of such a demand? England's allies felt deceived and betrayed. Thus, financial distrust arose among the allies themselves. It was very natural for France and Russia to see England's attempt to collect gold as a post-war financial supremacy plan. This distrust made it difficult for them to act together in the early years of the war, and the financial processes were nearly locked. At this point, the audience is drawn to a new question. If the three great powers were on the brink of financial collapse, and if they did not trust each other financially despite being so connected, how were they able to continue or resist the war for so many years? The answer was on the other side of the Atlantic. Earlier, we had signaled that America's light was beginning to shine and that it was coming into a position of power that would determine the fate of the world. But at this stage, we begin to see how it happened and took shape. In 1913, the United States entered an economic recession, but with the beginning of World War I, it seized a massive opportunity. Because crises create disasters for some, while they create opportunities for others. And this was exactly what America wanted. Europe needed bullets, steel, food, technology, and even cotton and wheat for the war, and almost all of these needs were supplied by America. This flow of demand and orders increased production in the United States by 32%. It grew its national income by 20%. Especially the steel industry, which had come to a dead point, became even more active than before thanks to the war. But the United States had a major handicap internally. The central banking system had just been established, and before 1915 it did not work fully. There was only one person who filled this gap and turned the crises into opportunities, J.P. Morgan. And at this point, the financial story completely changes direction, because Morgan would become a power not only financing Europe's war, but directing it. As a banker, how did this man reach a level of power that would hold the fate of three empires in his hands? When the war broke out, the United States was still neutral, because as a state, it had no ancient foundation, and its systems were newly being established. The Federal Reserve System did not function fully. Since there was no centralized power, all of Europe's demands for purchases and needs in America were being made irregularly through thousands of small banks, which caused prices to rise, coordination to fail, and time to be lost. At this point, England was looking for someone who would listen to its word and solve what it wanted smoothly, and they turned their eyes to one man who promised that he could solve their problems and demands without question: Morgan. England's aim was to secure the supply chain and, if possible, to completely break the United States' neutrality and pull it into its own camp. Morgan was the ideal figure for this. He was one of Wall Street's most influential figures, had wide connections, and had a structure compatible with the English financial tradition. And finally, on January 15, 1915, J.P. Morgan and Company was declared the official purchasing agent of the British government. This was not just a simple trade. This decision was a fracture that changed the financial rhythm of the war. Every product England bought from the United States, ammunition, steel, food, cotton, fuel, would go through Morgan. This was not just a commercial flow, it also meant that a political bond was being established. But why were France and Russia disturbed by this relationship? Because this special bond that England established with Morgan created concern and the perception among French and Russian financial circles that England is trying to strengthen its own hegemony. Moreover, England had previously demanded gold to lend to them, which had already damaged their trust. The same England was now holding all the financial gates in its hands in America by choosing a single intermediary. When France was forced to establish contact with Morgan to reach the credit it needed, its discomfort increased even further. No matter how uncomfortable France was, there was a reality. France and Russia had no alternative way to access the American market. For this reason, Alexander Ribot turned to Morgan. He had to choose Morgan as France's purchasing representative. At the same time, Russia also declared Morgan its intermediary in its borrowing in the American market. Thus, Morgan became a power controlling the keys of the financial gates that tied the hands of three empires in the middle of the war. This was a concentration of power rarely seen in history. So what results did this power produce? Remember this: whoever controls the money controls everything. Knowing this, Morgan was not only managing the financing, but also shaping perception on both sides of the Atlantic. From 1915 to 1917, through the press within the United States, Morgan slowly turned public opinion against Germany through 12 publishers and 197 newspapers under his influence. By using a bank's influence on public opinion, he ensured support for the war. At this point, the question that was wondered was this: how did the U.S. government view all of this, or why did it not intervene? No one enters a war for no reason unless there is an interest. The truth is, there was a clear discomfort. However, at the end of 1916, Morgan's request to issue short-term treasury bills on behalf of the U.S. Treasury was rejected by the newly established and not yet fully strengthened Federal Reserve Bank belonging to the American state. However, this attempt failed because the real power and control had already passed into the hands of private finance. The financing of the war had turned into a flow directed not by governments, but by Morgan's banks. And it was exactly at this point that a breaking moment of historical importance came. The only way to continue the war was for the U.S. Treasury to provide money directly. And this would only be possible if the United States entered the war. The secret meetings held in 1917 rapidly opened the path for the United States to enter the war. Why do the financial mechanisms created between 1914 and 1918 still govern our world today? Because during the war, in order for states to cover their expenses, they changed the true nature of money. The gold-based money system was buried in history. Central banks learned what unlimited expansion power meant by acting however they wanted, right or wrong, to control the market. If you liked it or found it helpful, you can subscribe, like, or share. The choice is yours. See you in the next video.